When did you last actually read the back of a tortilla package? Most people never do. And if you did, right now, you'd probably see a list of ingredients that has almost nothing to do with what a tortilla actually is. Because a tortilla, at its core, is one of the simplest foods on earth. Flour or corn, water, fat, salt. That's it. That's the recipe that fed families for centuries before any of us were born. So why does the tortilla in your fridge right now list 12 ingredients? 15? Sometimes more? Some of what's hiding in there is stranger than it sounds. There's a texture additive made from wood pulp, sitting quietly in the ingredient list of some of the most trusted names in the grocery aisle. There's a preservative doing a job your own kitchen used to do for free, keeping a fresh dough shelf-stable for 30 days at room temperature. Something real flour, water, and fat simply cannot do on their own. By the end of this, you'll know exactly which tortillas in your pantry are close to the real thing, and which ones are something else entirely, wearing a tortilla's name. If you've never checked what's actually in the food you eat every week, this channel exists for exactly that. Subscribe to this channel now, because we're about to open a lot more pantries after this one. Let's go check. Tortillas aren't a niche food. They're one of the most consumed bread products in the country. They show up in lunchboxes, dinner tables, and drive-through wrappers every single day, for people who never think twice about what's actually holding that food together. And that's exactly the problem. Because a tortilla doesn't read as processed food in most people's minds. It reads as simple, traditional, something your grandmother could have made in her kitchen with a rolling pin and a hot pan. That perception is doing a lot of quiet work for the companies that make them. Here's why the confusion happens. Food labeling in this country doesn't require a company to explain what an ingredient actually is, only to name it. So a package can legally list an ingredient like cellulose gum, a wood-derived fiber used to modify texture, right next to flour and salt, with no indication that one of those things came from a tree and the other came from a field. To the eye, they look like they belong to the same category. They don't. The same goes for bleaching. A lot of shoppers assume enriched flour and bleached flour are just different ways of describing the same wheat. They're not. Bleaching is a chemical whitening process applied to lower-grade flour to make it look more appealing on a shelf. And it has nothing to do with nutrition. The vitamins added back in afterward are there because the processing stripped them out in the first place. None of this makes a tortilla dangerous. That's not the claim here. But it does mean that the story printed on the front of the package, the heritage, the tradition, the made the authentic way, and the story printed on the back, in a language most people don't read closely, are very often telling you two completely different things. So which brands are actually living up to that front of package story, and which ones are borrowing it? That's where this gets specific. Take Guerrero. The name alone carries something most other packaged foods can't buy. It's been on shelves for decades, built specifically around Mexican culinary heritage. And it's the tortilla a lot of families reach for, specifically because it feels like the authentic choice, the one closer to what a grandmother would have made, not the generic industrial option. That belief isn't irrational. It's built on something real. Guerrero has spent years positioning itself around tradition, and for a lot of households, that positioning has actually worked as a proxy for quality. If a company understands the culture enough to market itself this way, the thinking goes, it probably respects the food enough to make it right. Store brands tell a different version of the same trust story. Great value, and labels like it never claimed heritage or tradition at all. Their entire pitch is the opposite. No story, no branding investment, just the lowest price in the aisle. And for a lot of shoppers, that absence of a story is its own kind of reassurance. Nothing to oversell means nothing to be skeptical of. The assumption is that a store brand is simply a cheaper, plainer version of whatever the named brand is doing. Not a different formula, just a different name on the bag. Both of these beliefs, the heritage story and the no-frills store brand story, hold up fine on the surface. Neither company has lied about what they are. Guerrero really has decades of cultural positioning behind it. Great value really is the cheapest tortilla on the shelf. But here's where the gap starts to open. When you actually put Guerrero's ingredient list next to great values, side by side, they are almost identical. Bleached enriched flour, cellulose gum, calcium propionate, sorbic acid, the same dough conditioners, the same mold inhibitors, the same industrial shelf-stabilizing chemistry, in both packages, regardless of what story is printed on the front. That's not a minor coincidence. That's the first real crack in the story most people have accepted without ever checking. So how did an entire industry end up running the same chemistry underneath, completely different brand identities? The answer isn't a conspiracy. It's an engineering problem that got solved once, and then every company copied the solution. Fresh dough, the kind made from just flour, water, and fat, is unstable. It molds fast, it dries out, it cracks when you fold it, and it behaves differently depending on humidity, altitude, and the quality of that day's flour batch. That's fine for a family making tortillas fresh every morning. It's a disaster for a company trying to ship millions of identical tortillas across the country and keep them edible on a truck, in a warehouse, and on a shelf for weeks before anyone buys them. So the industry solved it with a specific set of tools. Calcium propionate stops mold. Cellulose gum, the wood-derived fiber, holds moisture and texture so the tortilla doesn't turn brittle in transit. Bleaching lets manufacturers use lower-grade, cheaper flour while still getting a shelf-appealing white color. None of these were invented to deceive anyone. They were invented to solve a real distribution problem. But once one major manufacturer solved it this way, every competitor who wanted the same shelf life had to adopt the same chemistry just to compete, regardless of what heritage or tradition they were selling on the front of the bag. That's the part worth sitting with. The chemistry didn't spread because it made a better tortilla. It spread because it made a shippable one. And once it became the industry standard, there was no competitive reason for any major brand to move away from it, because doing so would mean a shorter shelf life, more spoilage, and a real cost disadvantage against everyone still using the stabilized formula. Which brings us to a brand that sells something even more specific than heritage, a weekly family ritual. Old El Paso didn't just sell tortillas, it sold Taco Tuesday itself. A seasoning packet, a yellow box, and a promise that dinner was already handled. And when you open that seasoning packet the way you'd open any other pantry staple, without a second thought, there's maltodextrin in there. A highly processed starch used as a flavor carrier, with a glycemic index higher than table sugar itself. Alongside it, silicon dioxide, an anti-caking agent whose plain language identity, the primary compound found in sand, never appears anywhere on the box. Neither of those ingredients is hidden. They're both listed, clearly, exactly where the law requires them to be. But listed and understood are two very different things, and that gap is exactly where this story lives. That gap between listed and understood gets more serious once you look at what's actually in the soft tortillas inside that old El Paso kit. Alongside the standard dough conditioning chemistry sits calcium propionate, the same mold inhibitor used across most shelf-stable tortillas. On its own, that's nothing unusual. It's approved, it's common, and regulators consider it safe at standard levels. But here's what most people don't know about that specific compound. In 2002, a controlled, double-blind, placebo-controlled study published in the Journal of Pediatrics and Child Health tested calcium propionate directly against a placebo in children whose behavior had already improved on an additive-free diet. More than half of them reacted to the preservative, with researchers documenting increased irritability, restlessness, inattention, and sleep disturbance. The study's own conclusion was carefully worded. These behavioral effects may be caused by the preservative in some children under the specific conditions tested. That single word, may, matters. This was one study with a small group of children, and it hasn't been the subject of a large-scale follow-up that would let anyone call this settled science. It is not proof that calcium propionate causes behavioral problems in every child, or most children, or even a predictable number of them. But it's also not nothing. It's a real, peer-reviewed finding that identified a measurable reaction in a controlled setting. And it's the reason some countries have placed tighter restrictions on propionate preservatives in foods aimed at kids. Old El Paso's entire identity is built around family dinners and young children at the table. That's not a side detail of the brand, it is the brand. And the ingredient this one study flagged for potential behavioral effects in children sits in the tortillas served as part of that exact weekly ritual. This is the moment the story shifts. Up to now, every brand in this investigation has been running the same industrial dough chemistry for the same reasonable, unglamorous reason: shelf stability. But this is the first ingredient where the question stops being, is this deceptive, and starts being, is this actually the right ingredient to put in front of a child every week without a second thought? If that surprised you, hit like right now. It genuinely helps more people see this before they buy their next box. That question doesn't have a clean answer yet, but it's the one worth sitting with as we zoom out to the bigger picture. Zoom out, and this stops being a story about 7 brands. It's a story about what happens when a food that used to be made fresh, every day, in every kitchen that ate it, gets handed over to an industry built around a single problem. How do you make something perishable behave like something that isn't? That problem doesn't just live in tortillas. The same chemistry, the same bleaching, the same shelf-stabilizing conditioners runs through bread, buns, wraps, and a huge share of what fills the center aisles of any American grocery store. Tortillas just make it easier to see, because the comparison to the original is so close and so recent. Somebody's grandmother, in a lot of these families, was still making tortillas by hand within living memory. That's not true of most packaged bread. This is also where the economics stop being incidental and start being the whole explanation. Once one manufacturer solves shelf stability with a specific set of additives, every competitor is boxed in. A company that wanted to sell an unstabilized, short shelf life tortilla at the same price point in the same national distribution system would spoil faster, waste more, and lose money against every competitor still using the stabilized formula. The chemistry isn't optional once you're playing at that scale. It's the price of admission to national grocery distribution, which means the heritage story, the family ritual story, the budget story, all of them are marketing built on top of the same underlying industrial reality. None of it is really a lie. Guerrero's cultural history is real. Old El Paso really did build Taco Tuesday. Great value really is the cheapest option on the shelf. But none of those stories were ever about the ingredients, because the ingredients were never the differentiator. The story was always the product being sold, not the tortilla itself. That reframes the actual choice in front of a shopper standing in that aisle. It was never authentic brand versus generic brand. It was always shelf-stable industrial tortilla, sold under one of several different stories, versus something that still resembles the original food. And only a couple of products in this investigation are consistently offering that second option. 2 tortillas in this investigation actually do what their front-of-package story promises. Siete is the more dramatic case, because it didn't start as a business idea at all. It started as a health necessity. The entire Garza family adopted a grain-free diet to support their sister Veronica, who had been diagnosed with autoimmune conditions requiring the elimination of grains. Their first creation was a grain-free almond flour tortilla. Their grandmother tasted it and said it was better than her own homemade version. That reaction is what turned a family accommodation into a company. Their Cassava tortilla, the one most widely available today, lists exactly 7 ingredients: cassava flour, water, coconut flour, coconut oil, apple cider vinegar, sea salt, and xanthan gum. No calcium propionate, no cellulose gum, no bleached flour, none of the dough conditioning chemistry that's run through every other brand in this story. Nothing on that label is doing a job that a real, compatible ingredient couldn't do on its own. The second is more specific than a brand name. La Tortilla Factory's standard corn tortillas, the ones on most shelves, actually run familiar chemistry: wheat gluten, calcium propionate, sorbic acid, the same shelf-stabilizing formula as the rest of this list. But their organic, non-GMO verified yellow corn line is different. Its ingredient list is 4 words long: water, stone-ground organic corn masa flour, organic guar gum, and lime. That's it. Real nixtamalized corn, prepared close to the way it's been prepared for centuries, with a gum for texture and nothing to fight spoilage chemically. The trade-off is a shorter shelf life, which isn't a flaw. It's just what unstabilized food actually does. Between them, these 2 products answer the question this whole investigation opened with. A tortilla was never a complicated food. It only became one when it needed to survive a truck, a warehouse, and a month on a shelf before anyone ate it. Most of the industry solved that problem with chemistry. A small number of companies solved it by keeping the ingredient list short enough that the food didn't need solving in the first place. So open the pantry tonight. Flip the package over. Count what comes after flour, water, fat, and salt. That number is the real story, whatever's printed on the front of the bag. Tell me in the comments what you found when you checked. And if you want the next investigation to go inside your bread, your cereal, or your lunch meat, subscribe to this channel and let me know which one first.